Greetings and welcome. My name is Professor Trevor Miller, and today we're going to be reading and studying about the rights, rebellion, and reaction of the 1960s into 1974. Now, while there are many groups that protested and formed the counterculture movement of the 1960s and early 70s, this lesson does not incorporate all groups and only touches upon a few. I strongly encourage you to read out of the textbook, watch the videos, and read the supplemented articles that are posted to help give you a broader perspective about the different groups that participated in this transformative era. With any lesson that I've presented so far, I've asked students to keep in mind the ideas of the era, that which was socially acceptable. Keep in mind the people, who they were, where they came from, what their socioeconomic status and position in life are, what their past experiences are. What was the relationship between the people and other peoples or groups of peoples, and the relationship between the ideas of the era. If you can put yourself in the shoes of the individuals, you can better understand the history of the era. So please try to keep that in mind as we progress through this lesson. Read through this week's chapters. I ask you to keep these things in mind as you, by the end of reading, you should be able to answer these questions, mainly about the accomplishments of both JFK and LBJ's administrations when it comes to civil rights. What civil rights organizations emerged during the time? What were their goals? And then how did that transform American society and the American government moving forward? 1960s kick off with JFK becoming elected. He was the youngest president ever elected into office. He was a charismatic young congressman from a very wealthy family, and he was challenged on the domestic front, basically communism, the spread of communism around the world, and America's entry into Vietnam. However, we are going to focus more on his domestic agenda and the creation or the counterculture movement that was created during his administration. And one of those that we're going to focus on is the Freedom Riders. They were a group of young men and women, African American and white, that was organized, and they challenged, after a Supreme Court ruling, Supreme Court ruling that banned discrimination on buses, transportation, interstate commerce, rest stops, hotels, those types of things around the country that had denied the abilities of African Americans to use those facilities. These Freedom Riders got together and rode through the South, and as they went through, they were attacked and discriminated against throughout their mission, and it helped to bring America's focus onto the inequalities and violence that was occurring throughout the South. After the Freedom Riders, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation in transportation facilities were unconstitutional. This helps provide a framework for other groups and organizations who want to help highlight discrimination and inequalities, that if they take social action, nonviolent social action, that they can make desired changes from around the country. And one of these is a gentleman named James Meredith. He wanted to go to the University of Mississippi, right, Ole Miss, and Ole Miss denied him. However, this was illegal discrimination, and it took the involvement of the National Guard and President Kennedy to get involved to ensure that this gentleman could go to class, which was his legal right. Another achievement under the Kennedy administration was the Gordon v. Wainwright Supreme Court case. In this case, it was declared by the Supreme Court that individuals who could not pay for attorneys, could not pay for their own defense, that would be provided by the government. Before this time period, that was not the case. Additionally, the Birmingham campaign begins. This is the campaign in Birmingham, Alabama, basically to try to take the public spaces of Birmingham, Alabama, an incredibly segregated city, and bring those inequities to light. This was championed by Dr. Martin Luther King, and we're going to cover this in depth. There's a very good video embedded in the classroom. I strongly encourage you to watch it. Like Dr. Martin Luther King were fighting in Selma, Alabama to remove racism and discrimination against African Americans in public places. Individuals like Medgar Evers worked for the NAACP in the South. This individual was shot in the back outside of his home, and he was found by his wife. When he was transported to the hospital by his wife, he was denied entry because he was African American, which is illegal. Now, when he was admitted to the hospital, he ended up passing, unfortunately, and it took until 1994 for a conviction to come forward. With the nation up in arms over race relations and the Jim Crow violence they were seeing on television, for many around the country, they had never seen such violence on their screens before, had not read about such violence at home in the papers before, so many took to the streets. There was a march on Washington where an estimated 250,000 people traveled to protest the inequities that African Americans and other minorities faced around the country. Here we have Dr. Martin Luther King give his famous I Have a Dream speech before this crowd. It took this action of these people to come forward to convince President Kennedy that civil rights legislation needed to come forward and had to be passed by the end of his term. Unfortunately, President Kennedy was assassinated before the law could come to a vote. Highlighted here is another example of violence that was occurring in the South based off discrimination. Here we have 4 African American girls who were killed in Alabama when the Ku Klux Klan put 15 sticks of dynamite in their church and blew a hole in it. There were more than 20 people injured, and the case was eventually closed by the FBI without convicting any individuals. Americans were saddened and upset by the level of violence that they were seeing unfold on their television, on their newspaper, on the radio, throughout their streets. So while they were taking to the streets and taking action, President Kennedy was assassinated in Texas. Here's an image of then President Lyndon Baines Johnson being inaugurated on Air Force One. Standing next to him is his wife and Mrs. Kennedy, who is now a widow. Johnson was an unlikely ally for the civil rights movement. He was a Texan, and he was a wealthy individual, and he came forward and became a champion of civil rights. Shortly after he took office, he helped pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It basically prevented any discrimination based off race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Now, while discrimination cases did come forward from then, they happen every day still, unfortunately. Here's the law that banned these actions at a federal level, which had never been done before. This act, this basically eroded the ability of southern states to have their Jim Crow laws, right? The whole idea of separate but equal went out the window. This was now one nation that could not discriminate legally in any way, shape, or form. Relations weren't the only form of protests during this window. One of the primary or more popular methods of protest was protesting against the Vietnam War, which was largely unpopular with America's youth, especially given the draft. And we have to remember that the draft targeted many minority or poor individuals. Many of the ultra privileged, ultra wealthy could opt out of being drafted, and the death toll that was occurring in Vietnam definitely didn't help things. Protests occurred around the country. Most of them were peaceful, and some of them, though, did turn violent. Beginning of this lesson, there were many groups that protest around the country. Now, these groups weren't always affiliated. They weren't always connected to each other. And here is one that had widespread support and opposition around the country. This is the second wave feminist movement. Basically, this is our movement where women wanted equality in all areas, not only under the law, but socially as well. Thousands of women's rights organizations around the country, trying to enable women to obtain equal rights, equal pay, reduce discrimination, reduce harassment around the country. And President Kennedy in 1963 passed into law the Equal Pay Act, which guaranteed that women could no longer be discriminated against for comparable work for male versus females doing roughly the same job. Now, while this wasn't just the only accomplishment of the second wave feminism or of the women's rights movement, this is a huge area which can be in-depthly studied and should be. There were many other accomplishments and achievements, as well as there were many other groups that protested throughout this period. Native Americans, Latino Americans, many other groups that had been discriminated against for many years protested to try to earn equality or earn their place in society that they felt that they were due. Brings us to the end of this lesson. Again, this material is meant to supplement your textbook and not replace it. There's many more articles and videos embedded in the classroom. I strongly encourage you to read and watch those, as it'll help you develop your ideas on the era, as well as it'll help you address the writing prompts in classroom discussions. Again, as you listened, I hope you could put yourself in the shoes of the individuals to understand the forms of discrimination they faced in nearly every aspect of their lives, why they wanted to make change, and how they went about making that change on both a local and a state and federal level. I hope you're enjoying the course and learning a lot. Best of luck to you this week.